Okay, I'll go ahead and kick it off then, I suppose, given this format that we're gonna try to run here. And I'll start with a tech caveat, which is that my Wi-Fi today has been on strike a couple of times. But it seems to strike very briefly, and so if I leave, I'll let Carla sort of riff on her own for a second. But hopefully, I'll be back very quickly. Um, so for those of you that I have not met, I've been at ERG since 2009, and I work mostly on energy analysis and energy engineering topics, and have recently been working on wildfire, and was approached by ERG to invite an alum to come talk in this session. I thought, wow, it'd be really cool to have Carla come. And so I'll let Carla say a little bit more about herself in just a second, but just for a quick introduction, she is now a Senior VP of Strategy and Regulatory Affairs at SCE. She started her PhD at ERG in 2005, I believe. But as somebody else had suggested, she right when she was wrapping up her dissertation, got pulled into a job actually at the Energy Commission as a commissioner there. I can't remember what year that was. It was when I was there, so it was 2011 or
2011. And I thought, oh, I'll wrap this up in the 2 weeks before I start the job.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I'll let you talk a little bit more about
5 years later.
After being at the Energy Commission for a while, then she transitioned to the PUC, and at both places did a bunch of really fantastic things. And right when she was finishing up at the PUC, got involved in a big wildfire report that Governor Brown had asked for. And since then is now at SCE and still working on these issues. And so I think she's a really terrific person to have come and kind of whose brains we can pick for a little while. So the way that I want to run this is I'm going to try to just have a bit of a conversation with Carla, maybe for 20 minutes or so, but then hopefully you all will have lots of questions as well. And so we'll run it that way. So I'm going to start actually with letting Carla fill in whatever details I missed on. I think I'm just going to leave it wide open and like, look at where you are right now. How did you get here? You know, in terms of like, you can answer that however you want. I just want to see like, what's the arc you described to getting to where you're at right now?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to have a conversation with you, Duncan. It's always a pleasure. We were reflecting on conversations that we used to have in person, and it's nice to do it from these positions. And hi to everyone. It's great to see some of my former classmates and fellow ERGies. It's been too long. So in terms of the arc of how I got here, and I guess to this conversation in particular, I came to ERG, as you said, in 2005, because I was really interested in addressing climate change. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew that at ERG, I could do anything. And so I was really focused, though, on climate change mitigation and technologies. And my dissertation was on incentives for solar. So I was thinking about solar and cap and trade. And then I had the opportunity, as Duncan noted, I was always interested in some type of state service and public policy. So when I was at the CEC and the PUC, I really focused on the development of emerging technologies, and in particular was proud of the work that I was able to do on energy storage policy and electric vehicles. But I noticed this change happen during my last couple of years at the PUC, and I don't think I appreciated at the time what that change really represented. And it was this movement from working on climate mitigation directly to starting to have to think about climate adaptation with the increase in wildfires. When I was appointed to the CEC and the PUC, no one asked me about wildfires. It just wasn't a topic. The last really big one from a utility was back in 2007 in San Diego. But then starting in 2017 and 2018, we started to see the rebirth of big fires caused by utility infrastructure. We also started to see just more fires everywhere. Utility caused fires are about 10% of fires that we have. So you hear a lot more about them, but we saw an increase overall. And so just as I was leaving the commission, there was a real focus and a need to actually have policy and regulatory rules around wildfire and wildfire mitigation. And then I thought, okay, well, I'm leaving the commission. I'm never going to have to really think about this again. I was asked by Governor Brown to chair a commission on wildfire cost and recovery, because wildfire has massive impact on infrastructure. It has human toll as well as economic consequence. And so I did that. And then I still thought I was never going to think too much about wildfire, because I was going to do something completely different, like philanthropy or something like that. But I got this opportunity to come to Southern California Edison and lead the strategy and regulatory work. And I decided to come to a utility because I do believe that electrification is the primary pathway to carbon reduction. And I think utilities have a real critical role. And at this time, utilities are trying to wrestle with how do you move forward on bold climate policy while having to adapt, because we're already in that space. So we had the worst wildfire year on record last year. And we spend a lot of time, all the utilities do, all the stakeholders, figuring how do you reduce wildfire risk from electrical equipment. And then I'll just one last point say wildfire is what I was really focused on. I still am, but now we're thinking more broadly about adaptation. And so I also hold the role of climate officer at Edison, and helping to lead a team on our first vulnerability assessment, looking at our infrastructure and how it's going to respond to all climate risks. So heat waves, flooding, mudslides. And so it's just been interesting. The arc of my career has been one of optimism, thinking that we were going to mitigate climate change, to maybe a place of realism now, where I know we have to both mitigate and we have to actually significantly invest in adaptation as well. So I'll stop there. And
Awesome.
Duncan,
Yeah.
leave it to
So
you.
we'll see if we can get back to that that adaptation mitigation issue in a bit. But I guess I want to give you a chance to kind of I'd like to hear how you frame the problem of dealing with the sort of the present danger that utility infrastructure presents to wildfire and like the state of California. Like how do you frame that problem from the perspective of somebody that's working at a utility?
I frame that problem. I mean, because I would, the way I would frame it is to say the mandate of utilities to provide safe, reliable, affordable power. There was a pretty known way how to do that for many decades, and that has really changed. And so really thinking about way we've approached wildfires, try to put it back in a real risk paradigm, really understanding what are the safety regulations that you need, what is safe practice, what is possible, and really trying to get more of an institutionalization around making sure we're managing that risk, because everything is trade-offs. You can harden your system to the absolute and try to remove all risk, but then it becomes unaffordable. So there are safety matters that we've dealt with in the past. I think when I talk to folks about why wildfire is so hard, it's because it's a risk that we still don't have the best understanding of. So we're talking about a risk that we're learning about in real time. We've been fortunately getting more information about it over the last few years. And the ways to reduce the risk are expensive. There are things that we can do on the grid side, but there are massive infrastructure investments, and that have not been done in most places in the world. And so getting customers and regulators comfortable with the type of investments we're talking about, given that there's not a lot of proof and concept of some of these, can be difficult. And if you've never experienced a devastating wildfire, then you feel a little removed from it. So we have customers who say, why am I paying for this? I don't live in a high wildfire threat area. What's my responsibility here? And so we've also really tried to frame the conversation around climate change, and that we are seeing the weather patterns change. This isn't just about infrastructure replacement. This is that the environment has changed significantly. And when you really start to look at the actual what's happening with fuels on the ground, how dry things are, heat waves, et cetera, I think people are starting to realize that it's not just a utility problem, it's a broader problem. And it could be a utility wire that sparks a fire, but you see a lot of fires sparked by barbecues and tires, and it doesn't matter the source of ignition, because it can end up being catastrophic.
So you're talking about sort of safe, reliable, affordable, And one
Clean.
thing that
Yeah,
I and clean. Okay, so this was the thing that I was going to mention, that when I teach about electric power systems, I often talk about this three-way tension between environment, affordability, and reliability, and those things kind of push and pull against each other. And wildfire, it's like those three things just turn it up to 11. It's just
Mhm.
it's coming out in such a massive in such a massive way. So I wanted to pick up. There are a number of things you just said that I think are really interesting, and one was talking about like the traditional utility business model and how it makes it makes it particularly hard to address this challenge. And or maybe I'm putting words in your mouth there, but I thought it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on how the way that utilities have done business up to this point are influencing the solutions that you can take. Like, is there some path dependency here? Or, how do you view that sort of history as kind of setting a trajectory for how you're solving these problems now?
Yeah, so as far as a couple of answers for me, I'll say from that history is about historically building infrastructure. And so there's definitely an approach of what is the infrastructure solution to what we're doing. So we can cover our wires, for example. But I've seen the thinking continuing to emerge about, well, what does that need to look like? What does infrastructure need to be? It doesn't have to just be wires. It can be, remote grids, for example. It can be, um, one of the tools that is not as controversial that we use are power shutoffs, right? At some point, does it make more sense to not provide power for a certain amount of time? And if so, how do you make sure that people have access to what they need? So we have programs, all the utilities do, to provide backup batteries for customers in high wildfire threat areas, because the idea is, sometimes you can't depend on the infrastructure, but people still need to have access to power. What's been interesting, where when you mentioned, is that there are things that the utility can do. There's a lot of stuff that utilities aren't the ones to do, right? And so making sure that you're having complementary activity, like significant vegetation management. We do vegetation management, but you need to have that in the forest. You need to have that in communities. And so you've seen Governor Newsom support a lot of investment, for example, in clearing brush. But you also have controversial solutions like, should property continue to be developed in high wildfire threat areas? Because the core to the utility model is the obligation to serve. And so the utility can't say, I'm not going to serve in a community. But there's a conversation that's been happening the last few years about, should we continue to build in communities that are at the intersection of a lot of risk factors for wildfire? And to date, there's not been the momentum to limit that. But then you very quickly get into a discussion that people live in some of these areas because of questions around housing affordability, right? They have to move further into the WUI. And so then people have to do that for economic reasons, but then there's this risk that's presented, and then people don't have enough insurance. So when a fire happens, it's even more catastrophic. So I think what we've seen is you can continue to invest on the infrastructure side, but we also have to think about some of the emergency and social systems and the broader economy that is creating a situation where we have this interface of humans as well as natural threats.
I want to pick up a little bit on something you said about just, this is multifactorial, and, there are a lot of non-utility things that need to get thrown at the problem. And I think about that a lot as well. And the fact that, it's just like the utilities providing the spark, right? But there's so
Mhm.
many other kind of factors involved.
And we take like
And
reducing that spark seriously. I want to be clear. I mean,
of course,
everyone
I
is,
know, right, of
it's
course,
essential for utilities to not cause
of course.
wildfires. No one's
Mm,
happy about that. And it really, the operation that happens. I mean, we are in wildfire preparedness all the time, because this year, for example, wildfire season, it started last week. We had our first event, in terms of having the conditions being so bad, we shut off power. But that means our last one was in January. So we had 3 months of not having what we call high wildfire conditions. And so it just really changed the complexion of how utilities are organized and what people think about. But yeah, to your point,
Yeah.
you can harden the whole world, and if you get one spark, it's suddenly you're just figuring how do you defend, how do you hold back
Right.
how do you hold back the fire? How do you do hardening of communities themselves? How do you prepare people for these emergencies?
Yeah. So I actually, okay, here, speaking of hardening, I think there's like a play on words here that relates to stuff that ergies always learn about, which is this sort of Amory Levin's hard path, soft path
Mm.
framing. And, I think that because of the intensity and the sort of immediacy of the problem, I tend to feel like we're taking kind of a hard path approach to solving this problem. And I wonder if you would, that there are other ways that we could solve this problem, whether it's by, in cases where curtailment is happening because of congestion on lines, there could be a demand response solution. I don't know how often that's the solution, but, or in other cases, like you said before, maybe there's a microgrid solution or a distributed energy solution to addressing the reliability issue rather than hardening. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a valid framing?
I do. And I'll say, I think you're expanding it to the conversation that we need to be having, which are what are the risks posed by climate change? Wildfire is a really obvious and prevalent one, but we deal just as much with heat, extreme heat events. When we had the reliability events last summer, when the utilities had to start shedding some load, this was August 14th and 15th, the first time we've had rolling blackouts in 20 years. That was because we had this regional wide heat event, right? And we simply did not have enough power to meet the need. The demand was so high. So Edison ended up having 800 megawatts of demand response called on that typically is not. And we saw there were signals, emails going out, weathermen saying, hey, everyone conserve your power in these hours, and people did it, right? And so demand response is going to be critical for managing some of these extreme events. And then what we saw happen around Labor Day weekend was you have this extreme heat wave, but that's also ripe conditions for wildfire. So that first Labor Day weekend, we had massive heat events. We also had multiple wildfires going. We had one called Big Creek, which was not utility caused. It took out Big Creek has a big hydro facility for us, nearly a couple thousand megawatts. The fire took out 3 out of 4 transmission lines for this hydro facility. So suddenly, we were coming on the precipice of having a power emergency because of that. And so what happens is you have these events compounding. Pardon me, I don't know who doesn't know that I'm talking to ergies right now and turning on my phone. And so it's in those types of situations where you do need to have flexible communities. And that's where some of the other stuff that we've been doing have been things like community resource centers, cooling centers. I'll throw up another term that I think is interesting, could be interesting to ergies, which is like adaptive capacity. So now that we're looking about, we're doing this assessment 10 to 50 years of all of our assets and how vulnerable they are to climate risk. All the utilities have to do it, but Edison is the first one up just because of how the timing is cycled, the timing is done. And specifically, we have to be working with disadvantaged communities to talk about what assets we think could be at risk due to climate change. And they're supposed to be providing us information on what is their adaptive capacity. Like if there is a power outage due to a climate event, can people get to work? Will people have access to cars to leave? Will they have enough food? And so talking about the soft path, there's a whole human component of human infrastructure that has been underdeveloped and has got to be complemented with the hardening that we're doing.
Awesome. So I'm gonna.
Can I ask you if you think that's a reasonable frame? That we're having a conversation. So do you think the Amory frame is a reasonable one?
I'm not sure if I think it's got some, it helps me to think a little bit about the right solutions. I think, like, I have this hypothesis that we are, because of the immediacy of the problem and because of the politics involved and because of the way that utilities have historically solved these problems, there's no other it's very difficult to take a path that is other than heavy investment in infrastructure and just making the infrastructure that we have harder, right?
Mhm.
Like but I think that there are other solutions, like I was suggesting, like maybe it's more distributed generation, maybe it's demand response in situations where you could, and I don't know how widespread those situations are, but maybe it's demand response. But I think the challenge is that in spite of the fact that we've been talking about those solutions for so long, the time it takes to deploy them
Yeah.
and the incentives that we have to deploy them are not don't sort of give us a favorable path to go that way. I think the incentives are all in the other direction.
I mean, it's also the
Um,
scale because I mean, what's happening here is at the same time we need to make the system more robust, more reliable. We also need to grow electricity if we think that's going to be the most cost-effective way to decarbonization. So we have a model that looks
right.
at getting to the 2045 state decarbonization goals, and our model estimates that we'll need 60% more electricity than we have now. We'll need 40% more at peak, right? So how you get to those electricity needs while at the same time decarbonizing is it's difficult. And we've looked extensively at
Yeah.
microgrids. I did some research on microgrids between my time in government and coming to SCE. And even microgrids, if they're in a high fire threat area, if you got overground wires, they shouldn't be operating either. So, microgrids allow us
Right.
for a more sectionalized approach to keeping the power on, but your solar system's at risk. I was just having a conversation today about inverter technology and getting like synthetic inertia, all these things that we need to do. And it all sounds really good, but the technologies aren't there at the deployment and scale. And so there is a lot, I think
Mm,
we could do things at smaller scales, but we still need the technologies to do it. And we still need a massive amount of investment to deploy. So I don't think I
yeah.
think I think it's a technology solution primarily. Is there a more elegant solution? Possibly if we can get the technology there.
So I'm gonna like queue up everybody else to
Okay.
put questions in the chat,
So your
or
eyes go like this
just
with
say you've got one.
synthetic inertia. I mean, you're like, oh, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I don't want to sort of go down into those weeds too much because we've got a bunch of projects actually on that topic right now,
Okay, good.
and
We need that.
but it is, you're right. It's like we are, it's not quite ready for prime time, although we're starting to work with Enphase right now on their microinverter solutions that provide grid forming inverters and
Oh, that's great.
setting up the coordination of those things. It's really cool stuff, but it's just a couple of years away, I
Yeah.
think. But I think that is a solution. That solution is particularly interesting to me because you can have like customer sited generation that people are putting it there maybe primarily because there's a net energy metering structure in place and it looks good from an economic perspective. But then um, there's a sort of an emerging set of new technologies that can basically mesh together, right? So if I manage to stay connected to a local distribution grid and my neighbors also have this technology, then we can start instantly sharing power for the way that these inverters are set up. So the balance just happens by virtue of like frequency as a common signal that we're all um, exposed to. So from a technology perspective, it's really exciting, and but we're not there yet, and it's not, like you're saying, it's not clear if that's enough,
Yeah.
right? And how long it takes to get that solution deployed.
And I know we're going to go to
Um,
questions, but I say, you're meshing that with our
yeah,
regulatory environment, which is we're doing our capital planning forecasts are out 10 years. I mean, they're really solid ones. And you're going for your rate case now every 4 years. And so thinking about, we have something we put out called Reimagining the Grid, which is looking at what does the grid need to look like in 2045. And when you actually say what it needs to be in 2045, we actually have to start investing in foundational technologies in the next couple of years, like
yeah,
lower latency communication and things like that. And so it's tricky because we kind of need to know now what we're going to do. And it is pretty hard to get buy-in that something's going to be the least cost effort. So but I think it invites a regulatory conversation about, how do we more quickly go about deciding a technology is mainstream enough and low cost enough to make that the preferred choice that a utility can get cost recovery for, because it does go back into what regulators feel comfortable approving for spend. So
Yeah.
anyway.
So there's a couple of good questions that I want to just like at least maybe make a point just to follow up on something that you were saying, which is in terms of hitting that 2045 goal with electrification. The thing that I think is looming large in my mind is the fact that all of this investment that utilities have to make is getting rate based and is pumping up, as we've got it structured now, our volumetric rates. And that means that like the electrification sell is only getting harder from a customer sort of operating cost perspective. And maybe if these other questions don't take long, we can come back and talk about that one as well. But so Mina had a question. Mina, do you want to just go off mute and go ahead and ask it?
Sure. I don't know if this is what the conversation is supposed to be about, but I'm definitely biting my nails thinking, wow, we're in unprecedented drought, and it's, the West is, it's a tinderbox right now. So beyond utilities, what are the solutions that the two of you see as moving the needle this season and in the future?
I mean, I would just say federal climate policy, number one, overall economy-wide reduction targets. There's been a lot of focus on the electric sector, and the electric sector has reduced relatively a lot more than other parts of the economy. And so better lands management, things on agriculture, so just more comprehensive policy overall.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that forest management is clearly a part of it. That's not my area, so I don't know how far it can go. But I mean, it's gotta help, and it just seems like there's more that we can do there. I also, one of the things, another sort of side, not electricity thing that I worry about or think about a lot is what is going to happen with insurance, for homeowners insurance for folks that are living in high risk areas. And you could say that if insurance goes through the roof, then people aren't going to be living there anymore, and so maybe that solves part of the problem. But coming back to some of the stuff that Carla was saying, there's equity issues and there are reasons that people are living there, and if it gets even more expensive, then it's even worse. So I don't know how that nut's going to get cracked. So okay, we had a question from, is it Taj, about resilience? Do you want to go ahead and just go off mute?
Yeah, sure. Nice to see everybody. Yeah, no, I just thought in terms of the hard path, soft path conversation, I think it's the dimension of resilience is actually one that is worth considering, because in, saying that we have to adapt to the new climate, which we do, and that, public safety power shutoff events become the new norm, we're actually basically saying that we have to adapt to an even less resilient system, especially for people who say maybe are on a medical baseline type of situation where they rely on electricity to survive. PSPS events are an extremely difficult event for them to manage. So while microgrids and other solutions do have their disadvantages, there's almost a vicious circle in resilience, in the sense that we're saying, that with the centralized power system, we now have the need to shut it down, and we're therefore making people basically without any sort of microgrids or localized power generation, they have no recourse whatsoever to support themselves.
It's a good question, and you're definitely focusing on one of the aspects that everyone collectively are now is focusing on, which is customers who are actually affected by PSPS who can't respond to it. How do they respond? Because just put in perspective, about 4.5% of Edison's customers went through a PSPS last year. So it is very location specific, but then you have communities where they went through 7 events, right? Because you continue to have the same weather events. And so there is a dedicated program for backup batteries for people who have medical conditions. Tell you one of the challenges we find is actually finding those people, right? So there are these programs that are being created, but frankly, we don't have up-to-date contact information like a cell phone or an email for maybe a third or something of customers. I mean, because people change, they move, right? So we've been doing what we can to find customers, but part of that is communicating with the CBOs, with the hospitals, and saying, let folks know that something is available. I think, on the microgrid solution, there are certain areas where microgrid makes sense, but it's also got to be, if there is a cost benefit. Does it make more sense if someone's going to go through a PSPS once or twice a year? It can make more sense to give people backup batteries for that total of 8 hours versus having a microgrid that you don't need to run all the time. And so what we have done is look at our circuits that have the higher incident of PSPS and say which ones of these would be appropriate for microgrids. And the idea is that over time, yes, PSPS should be going down. If we're actually hardening the grid right, if these infrastructure investments are going well, then you should see that decline. But that work takes time. And I think we've all seen that PSPS is disruptive enough that there's not the tolerance to have it go on as long as one needs to actually get the 5 or 6 years of hardening underway. So I think you've touched on a really good point. And I'll just say one other thing is that I've been thinking a lot about this reliability, resiliency continuum, and thinking about resiliency as the ability to manage through disruption. And that managing through doesn't have to be an on-grid solution. It doesn't have to be a utility solution. It could be a customer side solution.
Okay, so the chat's going crazy right now. It's super fun to see all the stuff that's showing up here, and I'm gonna maybe cherry pick a couple of things in terms of questions that are emerging. So actually, I just want to comment on one thing that JP, One Public IO, mentioned about utilities paying the value of lost load, or VOLL. And I'll just say, like, a comment on that is, well, what is it? And what is it for each customer at what power level? I mean, I think this is actually a place where we're doing some research now with surveys and looking at people's willingness to pay, or even what they are investing in for distributed generation. And I don't think that there's one answer for what that value of lost load is, even for one person. So I think it's an interesting idea, but it's pretty tricky. So I think,
I will
let's see,
make a general point too, because I'll make a general point.
Go ahead, Carla. Yeah.
That comes up as we talk about power shutoffs, which frankly have gone on for a long time, but not at the scale, of course, that they have now, which is, and then just about, there's a broader question about all of our customers are paying for a socialized grid, right? And one of the tensions that comes up is if you have a part of the grid that has certain needs, at what point, if those costs are being socialized across all customers, thinking about how do you do that cost effectively. I know that there's, folks raise concerns and say utilities are profiting from these investments and utility shareholders should pay. Well, I'll tell you, the first $5 billion of wildfire investment that was directed in the last couple of years, there's no return on equity, which is kind of unprecedented in terms of a utility model where you don't have any shareholder return. Just that investment goes in, it's recovered. So there's a shareholder component that is playing in all of this, but it comes back. And I think, very clearly, if the utility did something that was negligent or did not do something according to rules, then there are ways to make sure that the utility is held accountable. There can be penalties, investigations, et cetera. But for the most part, we are talking about situations where grids have been developed according to standardized practices, where investments have been approved by the PUC, and we're in a place now where those investments are not meeting the risk level that we're seeing. And so that's one of the things I think that we have to reflect on, which is, this was not predicted by most people that we were going to be in this state. At least we were talking about it big level from a climate change perspective. But now that we're in it, we are trying to figure out how to actually, because we're replacing investments that are not at their end of useful life, right? And you talk about the impact on electric rates. That is a challenge, right? We've invested in a system that's supposed to last a lot longer than it actually can. But I know there's a lot of chat is going nuts, so let's pick up some good ones here.
Well, I think I can see Carter, maybe you can give me a thumbs up or down on this, but are we, okay, we've got 2 minutes.
Okay.
I want to go ahead and ask the last question because I want to know what
we have addresses. Yeah, Nancy answered it. We have addresses, but people move around, so we don't always have accurate
Hmm.
phones. Okay. Let's see.
What constitutes success, Carla? Like, what's the end point?
I mean, for me, success is working on a different problem. Like, because there's always going to be, what I've learned in my time in like my career is that there's always a problem. Like, maybe it's the gas infrastructure safety, and then it becomes, you know, how do you integrate storage? But like, I think if we're moving on to a different problem, it means we've solved something.
Okay,
so,
all right, that's
I mean,
fair.
I think success is having an overall climate policy that is leading to like reduced emissions, like so that you know that you're not exasperating the problem. And then I think success is reducing as much risk as possible. And then frankly, at this point, helping communities be able to adapt. I mean, one of the things that the state is focused on is we're going through climate change. How do you help the most vulnerable customers be able to survive it? And so, that's also what I think success is, where you don't see as disproportionate impacts as we currently do. What do you think success is?
That's a good.
So Carla,
Gosh,
this is Chuck. I think success is if you limit power system shutoffs to very isolated, small numbers of customers in maybe high-risk areas. Because if it gets to the place where it's going to happen in widespread number of times in urban areas, it just seems to me, I don't see how you're going to achieve electrification goals. I don't see how you're going to get electrification of transport. I don't see how you're going to convince people to see electricity as a reliable service where most customers live. So it's this kind of segmented, targeted approach of making investments in places where you can really limit the PSP events to very small areas of the state to very.
I'll make it go. Sorry about that.
Can I answer this? Can I finish answering a question that got cut off in my session? So I'll say, Chuck, I agree with you. I'll say in the last year, you've actually seen reductions of, up to 30% across the utilities and shutoffs. And so it is also, I think, recognizing the tolerance is clearly close to zero, but the reduction has happened. And so, but I don't disagree with you. People need to feel like they have access to reliable power in order to be able to take on electrification. And we're getting there. All right, thanks.
On that note, welcome everybody back.